The rain hammered relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 64th floor penthouse, blurring the neon lights of the metropolis below into streaks of bleeding color. Richard Vance stood by the glass, holding a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25. His tailored Italian suit hung perfectly on his frame, a physical manifestation of absolute control. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. "Mr. Vance," Sarah, his impeccably dressed executive assistant, said softly, "he's here." Richard did not turn around. He merely took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Send him in, Sarah, and hold all my calls." Sarah stepped aside, allowing a figure to enter before quietly shutting the door behind him. Ben stood on the pristine marble, acutely aware of the puddle of rainwater forming around his scuffed work boots. He wore a faded navy blue canvas jacket that smelled faintly of damp wool and exhaust fumes. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of manual labor, were shoved deep into his pockets. He looked around the cavernous office, his eyes reflecting a mixture of awe and deep, settling sorrow. "You're late, Ben," Richard said, finally turning to face his younger brother. His voice was smooth, polished, like the surfaces in the room. "The subway doesn't run on your schedule, Richard," Ben replied, his voice rougher, carrying the gravel of exhaustion. "And the roof at the warehouse started leaking again. I had to stay back and cover the inventory." Richard offered a thin, practiced smile. He walked over to a wet bar carved from solid slate. "I can have Sarah call you a black car next time. It's no trouble. Drink?" "I don't drink anymore. You know that." "Ah, right. 3 years, is it?" Richard poured himself another measure of amber liquor. 4, Ben corrected. He shifted his weight, leaving a muddy footprint on the weight floor. He looked down at it, then back up at his brother. "Let's just get this over with, Richard. I've been on my feet for 12 hours. Why did you insist I come all the way up here?" Richard walked to his massive, clutter-free desk. Resting precisely in the center was a thick manila folder. He tapped it with one manicured fingernail. "The final appraisals came in for the old neighborhood block. Mother's estate is fully out of probate. We own the deeds to the entire street, including the old community center." "I know," Ben said, his jaw tightening. "We agreed. I keep the center, you take the commercial lots on the corner. We renovate it, give those kids a place to go after school so they don't end up on the streets like we did." Richard sighed, an exaggerated sound of patience. He opened the folder and slid a dense legal document across the polished wood. "Plans change, Ben. Horizon Dynamics wants to build a luxury tech campus in that district. They need the whole block, every inch of it. They are offering $15 million for the land." Ben stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't step closer. $15 million? "Half of which is yours, Richard," Richard said, leaning forward, resting his hands on the desk. $7.5 million, Ben. Tax-free, routed through a trust I've already set up for you. No more warehouses, no more leaking roofs. You're set for life. All you have to do is sign." Ben's eyes slowly rose from the desk to meet his brother's gaze. The quiet hum of the penthouse suddenly felt deafening. "And what happens to the people, Richard? What happens to the 300 families living in those apartments? What happens to the center?" "They'll be bought out," Richard said dismissively, waving a hand. "Relocated. It's urban renewal, Ben. It's progress." "Relocated?" Ben echoed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "You and I both know what relocated means. It means evicted. It means pushed out into the cold so some tech billionaires can drink artisanal coffee where Mrs. Gable used to run her bakery." "Mrs. Gable is dead, Ben. The bakery has been boarded up for a decade." "But the people are still there." Ben stepped forward, his voice rising, shattering the manufactured calm of the office. "Our people, Richard. You want to bulldoze the only sanctuary those kids have just to add another zero to your net worth?" Richard's smile vanished. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I brought you here to make you rich, Ben. Don't make the mistake of turning this into a moral crusade."
"This isn't a crusade," Ben shot back, slamming his hand onto the edge of the desk. "It's a promise. We promised Mom we wouldn't forget where we came from. I haven't forgotten. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. He slammed his whiskey glass down, the liquid sloshing over the brim. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. I remember every single miserable second of it. Do you remember the winter of '98? Ben looked away, his jaw clenched. I try not to. Well, I don't have that luxury, Richard hissed, stepping into his brother's personal space. I remember the ice forming on the inside of our bedroom window. I remember Mom coughing blood into the kitchen sink, hiding it from us, pretending it was just a cold because she couldn't afford a doctor. I remember the sheer, unadulterated terror of being completely, utterly powerless. We were kids, Ben whispered, the anger draining from him, replaced with a heavy, old grief. We survived it. We had the community. People looked out for us. People pitied us, Richard snapped. They gave us scraps. I didn't just survive, Ben. I dragged myself out of that gutter. I swore on her grave I would never let anyone look down on us again. I built an empire to ensure it. Wealth isn't just money, little brother. It's armor. It's immunity from the cruelty of the world. By inflicting that cruelty on others, Ben retorted, looking Richard up and down, seeing past the expensive suit. You think you're immune? You're stepping on the same people we used to be. You're becoming the landlords Mom used to cry over. There is no same people, Richard pacing now, agitated, his composure fully shattered. There are those who push and those who are pushed. Poverty is a meat grinder, Ben. It tests how much bone you have before you snap. It tries to kill you every single day. You think you're strong because you stayed in the grinder and learned how to bleed quietly? I am strong because I broke the machine. Ben watched his brother pace. He saw the frantic energy, the desperate need for justification. You didn't break the machine, Richard, Ben said softly, his voice cutting through the tension with lethal clarity. You just bought a controlling share in it. Richard stopped. He stared at Ben, his chest heaving slightly. You think you're safe up here? Ben gestured to the expansive glass and the storm outside. Look at you. You have $50 million in the bank, senators in your contact list, and yet you're sweating because your warehouse worker brother won't sign a piece of paper. You're terrified. I am a realist, Richard coldly replied. You're empty, Ben corrected. You spent so long building your armor of gold that you didn't notice you were suffocating inside it. You've convinced yourself that because you're no longer starving, you're somehow invincible, but you're weaker now than you were when we were sleeping in coats. Richard's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He walked back to his desk, took a deep breath, and smoothed the lapels of his suit. The polished, ruthless executive returned. You want to talk about reality, Ben? Let's talk about your daughter. Ben froze. Leave Emma out of this. Emma, Richard said, picking up a different file from his desk. 21 years old, brilliant girl, accepted to Johns Hopkins Medical School, a dream come true, right? Except the tuition is $90,000 a year. You remortgaged your house, you're working double shifts, and you're still coming up short. Ben's breathing grew shallow, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'm handling it. You are drowning, Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He reached into his breast pocket, produced a sleek silver pen, and laid it gently on top of the contract. $7.5 million, Ben. You sign this paper, and her entire education is paid for tomorrow, fully funded. She graduates debt-free. She becomes a surgeon. She never has to know what it feels like to choose between heating the house and buying dinner. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the muffled drumming of the rain against the glass. Take off the martyr crown, Ben, Richard urged, his tone suddenly soft, almost pleading. You are exhausted. I can see it in your eyes. You are breaking your back to prove a point to a neighborhood that will forget you the moment you die. Save your daughter. Save yourself. Sign the paper.
Ben stared at the silver pen. It seemed to glow under the recessed lighting of the office. $7.5 million. He thought of Emma. He thought of the dark circles under her eyes as she studied late into the night, worried sick about the student loans. He
He thought of his own aching back, the creeping arthritis in his hands, the terrifying reality of his bank account balance. With a shaking hand, Ben reached out. His fingers brushed the cool metal of the pen. Richard exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. A small, victorious smile played at the corner of his mouth. "It's the right choice, Ben. I promise you. It's the strong choice." Ben picked up the pen. He looked at the heavy, legal weight of the contract. Then he looked up at Richard. He saw the victory in his brother's eyes. But beneath the victory, he saw something else. He saw the cold, mechanical, transactional nature of a man who believed everything and everyone had a price tag. If Ben signed, Richard wouldn't respect him. Richard would just have proof that his cynical worldview was absolute. Ben thought of the community center. He thought of the kids playing basketball on the cracked pavement, finding a brief respite from the harshness of the streets, the exact same respite that had kept him and Richard alive. Slowly, the trembling in Ben's hands stopped. He didn't look at the contract anymore. He just looked at his brother. "You know, Richard," Ben said, his voice incredibly calm, resident in the quiet room, "growing up the way we did, it pushes a man to his absolute limit." "It does," Richard agreed, eager to close the deal. "Sign it." They say poverty tests a man's strength. It tests how much you can endure without breaking. It tested me today, right here. The temptation to take this easy way out, to save my family by destroying others, it was the hardest test of my life. Ben placed the pen gently back onto the desk, pushing it away from the paper. "And I passed." Richard's smile vanished. Confusion followed quickly by rage clouded his face. "What are you doing? Are you insane? Think of Emma." "Emma will be a doctor," Ben said, a fierce, undeniable pride in his eyes, "and she'll do it knowing her father didn't sell his soul to pay for it. She will do it with honor, something you can't buy." Ben took a step back, turning his collar up against the imaginary cold of the room. "We both survived the poverty, Richard. We both proved our strength." Ben looked at the opulent room, the expensive whiskey, and finally at the hollow, furious man standing behind the desk. "You walk out that door, you get nothing," Richard roared, his voice echoing off the marble. "I'll tie this estate up in court for decades. You'll die in that warehouse." Ben paused with his hand on the brass handle. He looked over his shoulder one last time. "You failed the test, Richard. You're the poorest man I know." Ben opened the door and walked out, the click of the latch echoing loudly in his wake. Richard Vance stood alone in his 64th floor penthouse. The check for millions of dollars sat untouched on his desk. He reached for his whiskey, but his hand was shaking so badly he knocked the crystal tumbler over. The amber liquor spilled across the polished wood, dripping onto the pristine white floor, looking remarkably like a stain that could never be washed out. Outside, the storm raged on.